Good morning. It is good to see you this morning and to welcome you back and to welcome you who are both here and watching via live stream and those who will watch the archives of the 2014 Cole Lectureship. This lectureship was established in 1893 by Colonel E.W. Cole of Nashville to bring distinguished lecturers to the campus in defense and advocacy of the Christian religion. The 2014 Cole lecturer, Dr. Tex Sample, is a storyteller whose stories are not always tall tales or oversized yarns. His stories also point to our utter humanity, and they challenge our assumptions as he points the way to a justice rimmed with God's mercy and sustained by God's and the Holy's presence. For Tex, we all belong to God's story, and this calls us to a way of life molded by worship, communion, ministries of caring, justice, and peace. He is a prolific author exploring the lives of working class folks, the legacy of Reinhold Niebuhr, the homosexuality debate in the United Methodist Church, and the power of spirituality and worship. Sample is a specialist in church and society, a United Methodist minister, a storyteller, author, and the Robert B. and Kathleen Rogers Professor Emeritus of Church and Society at the St. Paul School of Theology, a United Methodist seminary, which I still consider to be in Kansas City, Missouri, where he taught from 1967 to 1999. He is currently serving as interim minister of Trinity United Methodist Church, an inclusive congregation that welcomes gays and lesbians in Kansas City, Missouri. An interviewer once noted that, quote, "Eventually you realize there's something faintly autobiographical going on as Sample tells you a story about his friend, a Southern Baptist preacher to whom Tex gives the pseudonym Jimmy Hope Smith. Reverend Jimmy gives every indication of being a stereotypical fundamentalist. He speaks with a thick Southern accent, laced with intentionally incorrect grammar and deliberate malaprops. Behind that facade, however, is a highly educated man thoroughly conversant in numerous schools of philosophical thought, obtained through the course of earning a PhD in a prestigious Eastern university. Whenever Reverend Jimmy encounters elitist Yankees pontificating on the lowbrow tastes of the uneducated working class, he doesn't get mad. He begins to subtly challenge their intellectual assumptions, allowing them to feed on their obvious self-importance and certainty, and before they know what's happened, they're hopelessly entrapped in their own arguments. I have watched this happen with Dr. Sample. The theme for Sample's Cole's lectures this year is walking the walk, talking the talk, walking the walk, fluency in other material practices in ministry. This morning, Dr. Sample's focus is walking the walk, the formation of material skills in ministry. After this morning's lecture, we will have a question and answer period, so get ready. I ask you now to join me once again in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Tex Sample.
Good morning. I am delighted to be here. I think I said that last night, but it truly is so. And I so appreciate the warm hospitality that I've received here, not only from Dean Emily Towns, Shatika Brown, and others on the staff and the faculty of the school. Appreciate very much this invitation, and I've had a wonderful time. I'm sure it will take Peggy some time to keep me from being so spoiled when I get back home, but appreciate it very much. We were celebrating my son's birthday, and we'd invited some of his friends to come to the house, and I had a big platter of food. We had some chicken and some steak and some pork, and I had it on this platter I was taking out the door. Now, we've got a dog at our house by the name of Jazz, and she prefers negative attention to no attention at all. And she's smarter than we are. So as I leave that room, she figures out that I've got to come back the same way I went out. And she lies down across the path I've just made. I burn the meat, bring it in. I've got the big platter. I can't see the floor. I push the door open and start across the room. And just as I raise my right toe, I catch her stomach. It doesn't hurt her, but it trips me. And I fall head first. I broke the fall a bit with a corner that was over here. It put a bruise from my wrist to my elbow. But I fell flat with that pan of meat held out like this. I did not drop a single piece of meat. I got up off the floor, and Peggy says, "Are you all right?" "Well, sure, I'm all right. I just fell down." "No, are you all right?" "I'm fine." I walk over to the sink, and I am there, holding the meat, looking down in the sink. "Are you in shock?" "No, I'm not in shock." "Well, you act like it. What's wrong with you?" "I'm thinking." "You're in shock." The woman does not know I am bulletproof, all right? And she says, "What are you thinking about?" I said, "I'm thinking about why I did not drop the meat." "You're in shock." I said, "No. Oh, I know. Catching. I didn't drop the meat because of catching. When I was in college, if you pitched, which is what I did, you only got to play the first game of the week. When the second game came, you had to sit out. Well, I didn't like that. Well, we needed a catcher, and I said, well, I could catch the second game. So I started pitching the first game and catching the second. One of the things you have to learn as a catcher is to hold the ball when you get run over. Got the picture? Now, one of the ways you do that is somebody stands about where you are, 20 or 30 feet, and they throw a soft toss. Why a soft toss? Because you have to concentrate more on the ball, and because of the bundlesome of a catcher's mitt, you have to make sure you secure it, all right? So they throw you a soft toss. Meanwhile, somebody else is over here on your right side, perhaps, with a great big pillow. And what they do is they time it so that as soon as that ball hits your mitt, they swing that pillow at you as hard as they can swing it, and they bang! You got it? So you stand there, and it's catch, bang, catch, bang, catch, bang. They do that so that you get over the inclination. You know, you have an inclination when you get hit to relax your grip. And what they're trying to do is to train you to hold the grip when you get hit. All right? I want to say to you that what this whole lecture is about today is about not dropping the meat. One of my concerns about the church is that I do not often see the serious attention to practices and training that's involved in learning to hold a ball that we engage in to learn the practices of a way of life. And if I had any word for the church today, it would be, how do we begin to engage in practices and the kind of training that can form and shape our lives in that sense? So I guess I'm speaking out of what I like to call, well, it's not mine, I think it's Alasdair MacIntyre's, the craft tradition of knowing. Basic to that in MacIntyre, he says, in that tradition, you have to be shaped by the object which you wish to know. You know, if you're going to learn about catching, you've got to enter into the practices of catching and be shaped by whatever's involved in that kind of activity. John Milbank talks about attunement. He says that one has to be attuned to receive the kind of learning and training that I'm trying to aim at. I love Talal Asad. You heard that last night. I won't do too much with him today, but he says this: the body is our first and most natural instrument. He says the body is an assemblage of embodied appetites. I had an interesting thing happen when I have a dictation program in my computer, and I dictated that embodied appetites, but my computer speaks Yankee. It does not understand Southern enunciation. And the way it read it was, it read it invited appetites. Invited. And I kind of like that. You invite appetites, you know, the forming of them, the shaping of them, by engaging in the kind of activity and the kind of training that will form and shape those very appetites. Related to that, interestingly to me, is a comment by Marcel Mauss. He wrote a wonderful book on the gift. He was a nephew of Emile Durkheim that some of you have perhaps read. And he says this. Now, he may not have this altogether right. But you know, you don't have to have people have things altogether right to learn from them, okay? But he says this: at the bottom of all our mystical states are body techniques. They are necessarily biological means of entering into communion with God. And then he says something like this: the inability to enter into communion with God becomes a function of untaught bodies. He's trying to say that mystical states arrive because of the kind of practices we engage in, or they do not because we've left those practices. Now, I know that raises a question of grace, and we'll come to that at the end, but hang on to that notion for a moment. Is there some sense in which he's correct? That is, that we do need to be attuned to God and take those responsive practices, take those responsive, he uses the word techniques, take those responsive techniques as way of responding to the grace that God has given us. So think about that craft tradition of knowing and how we form ourselves and shape ourselves to the faith, and also how we are formed and shaped in ministry. Now, when you start talking about walking the walk, and you start talking about practices of faithfulness, I think intrinsic to that is the formation of what Walter Ong used to call the sensorium. What he means by the sensorium is the way that our senses, our seeing, hearing, taste, touch, smells, he argues that these are formed historically and socially in us. That we don't just have natural ways to see, that those are culturally, historically shaped. Right? Let me go to Goethe, the great German literary figure. He has this notion of behold, or beholding. Listen to the way he talks about it. He says, in order to behold something, you have to cultivate the senses. It requires a transformation of the self. We have to fashion new organs of perception. And when we do this, it enhances our cognitive capacities it enhances the world. My spouse is an artist. One of the things, I'm around a lot of artists, and I'm not musical in that way, but what I love to be is just a fly on the wall or in the group. When those folks notice a scene or some kind of an object they want to paint. Because what I love to hear is to hear them talk about the shapes and the forms that they see. And they bring up things that I cannot see, I do not see until that's the importance of language again, until they name them. But they are so formed and shaped to see the world, they see it in those terms. And I want to say that about ministry too. And I'm talking about both lay and clergy. I'm not talking about the ministry of the clergy only. But ministry involves that capacity to see, hear, taste, touch, smell the world. Mac Charles Jones, he's dead now, was an extraordinary pastor in a black Baptist church in Kansas City. It just so happened that the disciples were having a national meeting in Indianapolis, and I got invited to lecture that morning. They invited Mac Charles to preach that afternoon. They had that one right. So it was an open-air downtown worship service in a park. And I mean, you know, good crowd, and Mac Charles rang the chains, all right, as he can do. But of course, he rang the chains for a little longer than he might have. And when he finished, we had 30 minutes to get to an airport that lay 20 minutes away. So he and I are striding down this wide sidewalk, headed for a cab at the corner. As we're walking, there's a homeless man, classic plaid store breeches, big overcoat. He's lost a little cheap wine down that coat, but he's figured out who we are. So as he comes toward us, he's 15 feet away, he says, "Pastors, could you provide me with a little change?" And I said to myself, hey, Mac Charles has had a ministry with homeless people for years and years. I'm going to watch and see how he handles this. So I slow a half step, and Mac Charles, who weighed about 350 pounds, 6-something feet tall, he raises his arms, and he's got on an overcoat. And when Mac Charles raises his arms with an overcoat on, it blocks out the sun, all right? And he just envelops this man in a huge hug. And he says, "Brother, we've got some money and we're going to give you some, but you need to eat. We're going to take you to lunch." Lunch? I say to myself, I don't say it to him, lunch. We don't have time to take this man to lunch. We're going to miss the airplane. He says, "Come on, mister. We got this cab right here. Get in this cab with us. We're going to lunch." He gets in the cab. We're over here on one side. Mac Charles takes up half the seat. You got the picture, all right? He says to the driver, "Driver, head for the airport as fast as you can go. You find a fast food place that's right on the sidewalk, and when you get there, you stop. We're buying this man lunch." That's exactly what he did. We put together, I don't know, $20, $25, ran in there with him and told the guy at the cash register, "Give this man everything he wants to eat, but make sure he eats it. And when he finishes, give him the rest of this money." And we shook his hand and took off. We had plenty of time. We made it through that gate. They closed that door right behind me as we went through it. But you know, I've thought about that 1,000 times. I saw that man as a block to our getting to the airport on time. Mac Charles saw him as a brother, and it made all the difference in the world. Huh? It's that kind of capacity to see, but it's also hearing. It's taste, it's touch, it's smell. John Flowers has had a wonderful ministry with homeless folk, 12 years in San Antonio. And I was struggling one day. I'd read Constance Clausen's wonderful book on aroma, smell. Read it. It's beautiful. But I was not getting anywhere with smell in ministry. So I called John. I said, John, I'm working on smell and ministry and how we learn to smell and how we learn to use smell, and I'm not getting anywhere. And John said, oh, that's easy. I wanted to hit him. Easy. Come on. I said, all right, well, what do you do with smell? He said, well, when I first got to San Antonio, he said, I realized that I had to learn to use my nose better. And he said, across the years, I learned this, that if a homeless person smelled bad, that probably meant they weren't very functional. And so what that meant was that I needed to respond to them differently. He said if a homeless person smelled pretty good, they were pretty hygienic, I learned that that meant they were fairly functional. And that required a different kind of, move from me. Hear it? So training your smeller, training your capacity to see, to feel. Can't do this now, but look at Sarah Miles's wonderful book, Take This Bread. Miles is a chef, but also has begun this ministry at St. Gregory of Nyssa Church in San Francisco. And the way in which she works with taste and the taste of food, the way she's so been formed, and the way in which she relates to people through the Eucharist and through food and through taste. Of course, it's also a question of dispositions. It's not only how we form our senses, but also the way we are disposed to the world and how that shapes us in terms of ministry. Congressman John Lewis has the reputation of being the most beaten person in the history of the civil rights movement. That's quite a reputation. And he's known in the Congress as the conscience of the Congress. He wrote an autobiography, and he talks about the time when he was growing up. They lived 6 miles, I think it was, from a Baptist church, and they rode a wagon pulled by a mule to church every Sunday. They were on this small farm, eking out a living from that land. And when he was 7 years old, they put him in charge of the chickens. Listen to his report on that. Talking about the chickens, he said, they seemed so defenseless, so simple, so pure. There was a subtle grace and dignity in every movement they made, at least through my eyes. But no one else saw them that way. To my parents, brothers and sisters, the chickens were just about the lowest form of life on the farm. Stupid, smelly nuisances, awkward, comical birds, good for nothing but laying eggs and providing meat for the table. He goes on. Maybe it was their outcast status. The very fact that those chickens were so forsaken by everyone else, that drew me to them. I felt as if I had been trusted to care for God's chosen creatures. Lewis thinks that his concern and care for the chickens was the first indication of what would come to shape my character and eventually guide me into the heart of the civil rights movement. Qualities I certainly could not name at the time, such as patience, compassion, nonviolence, civil disobedience, and then I love this, and not a little bit of willful stubbornness. Let me ask you to do the kind of inventory I do on myself. What are the practices in which we engage that keep us from dropping the meat of ministry, that form and shape the ways in which we see, hear, taste, touch, and smell the world, that provide us with the kind of disposition that can lead us into the kind of work that a John Lewis was able to do? Now, don't mean to suggest it's all formation of senses and dispositions. There's also know-how in practices. Keep this in mind. There is know about, and there is know how. And to know that distinction is crucial. And to learn both is important. Oh my goodness. I saw dozens of students from Plowed Ground, Missouri who came to seminary and figured they didn't need to learn much. I can tell you I've watched their careers now for 30 years, and let me say to you, they really did. We also had people who said, yeah, and you also need to know how. And that's correct, too. Know of, know about, know how. They've got to be one in a faith that is dedicated to a way of life, not only a view of life. Let me give you some examples of people that I like who manifest that. Meryl Streep. Do you love Meryl Streep? I love Meryl Streep, and Peggy knows, okay? It's okay. Meryl Streep was on Ellen's show. Do any of you ever watch Ellen? We record it so we can watch it because we can't watch it then. She had Meryl Streep on, who is an extraordinary actress. And you know how Ellen, if you've ever seen the show, she plays tricks on people. Here's what she did to Meryl Streep. She gave her first a recipe, and she said, now, Meryl, I want you to read it in a very sexy way. I know when I'm in the company of my betters, so I will not try to imitate that. But let me tell you, she pulled it off. And then immediately following that, she said, Meryl, I want you to give directions to a place somewhere as a woman in labor. And you can imagine, you take the first, I mean, you know, it was simply brilliant. Huh? And then she said, I want you to give Wikipedia selections as a rebellious and angry teenager talking to your mother. And what was so amazing was how Meryl Streep could go from one to the next, and could simply shift gears. That's not knowing about acting only. That's knowing how to act. I love Laurence Olivier. Listen to what he says. I don't know, have you ever been in a play? Memorizing lines is terrible. What do you do when you have to memorize Shakespeare, for crying out loud? All right? Listen to what he says. He says that I conditioned my tongue muscles because what I did was I repeated lines of dialogue to myself again and again until I conditioned my tongue muscles to a point of absolute obedience. And then notice what he says, and so gained total freedom. Conditioning, he said, I could forget about memorizing the lines and simply act. Huh? Wow. But those folks are famous. Let's do another. Peggy and I were driving back from Arizona, Phoenix, to Kansas City 2 years ago, this month actually. And we stopped to spend the night in Elk City, New Mexico. We spent the night, got up early to take off again, went into the little restaurant there at the motel. The restaurant had 12 tables. I know I'm sometimes too much of a spectator because when I see something, I like to, I even counted the tables. There was only one waitress, and the tables were 3/4 full. She came over when we sat down and she said, I've been doing this for 42 years and I just love it. And I asked for decaf coffee. And she said, I just put a pot on when I saw you come through the door. What'd she mean? She recognized we were old and figured we would be drinking decaf coffee and not high-octane coffee. She figured it out when we walked through the door. She put the coffee pot on before she ever spoke to us. You got the picture? Then I told her I wanted an egg and sausage and toast and a bowl of oatmeal. She brought me a cup of oatmeal. She said, I know you ordered a bowl, but I know how much we serve, and I figured you couldn't eat more than a cup. She was exactly right. Exactly right. She was cordial. She was of good cheer. She kept up with those people in 3/4 of those tables, had a special word for each table, each person as she worked that place. I want to say to you, that is know-how. And when we open our eyes to it, we can see it in the society. And I'd say when you see it, think about it as metaphor. Think about it as illustration. Think about it as instruction. Think about it as training where somebody's showing you how not to drop the meat. Okay? Now, I want to say this too. There is a difference in people in terms of how they relate discourse or talk to practice. Okay? And what that means in ministry is you can get it said with some folk, but that doesn't work with practice. And yet there's some other folks, until you say it right, they don't get it right. All right? I wasn't much of an athlete. I was an average college pitcher. But I remember that I never learned to throw a curve until somebody taught me. I'd been trying to break that thing, and it just wouldn't break. And somebody said, Tex, what you've got to do is when you get out here almost fully extended, they said, it's like pulling down a shade in a house. You won't believe this, but the first time I did that, the ball broke. I thought somebody had just turned water into wine, okay? But I'm that way. Now, this little story, and I promise not a single other baseball story, okay? They tell me that Mickey Mantle and Ted Williams sat down one day for an hour and talked about hitting. Now, Ted Williams was a great student of hitting, and he may have known as much about it as most anybody who was also Williams was a terrific hitter, 340 lifetime batting average. He was in the service, I think, 4 or 5 years while he was an active player. If he had played those 4 or 5 years, he'd have been in the top in terms of home runs, RBIs, and everything else. But Williams knew about, and he knew how. He's got a thing where he talks about keep your shoulder down, keep your head in, don't pull out, don't pull your head up. That's a ground ball if you hit the ball at all. He talked about step toward the pitcher. He talked about the grip your hands, but don't lock, grip firmly, but don't lock your wrists. I mean, he could just go on and on like that. Now, Mickey Mantle may have been, let's put it this way to be careful. Mickey Mantle was one of the greatest physical talents ever to play that game. He was the fastest person in both leagues when he was young, and there were black players playing that. He had an arm, and oh goodness, could he hit for power. They say he hit a ball 527 feet once. But Mantle, let's be gentle. Mantle was not an intellect. But he and Williams sat down to talk about hitting. And after that, Mantle went 27 at-bats without a single hit. He was so busy thinking he couldn't hit the ball. Do you understand? I'm trying to say that's true about ministry too. There are some folks for whom discourse becomes distractive. That doesn't mean you don't need to learn things. You need to learn things. But there's a sense in which what those folks do is then let it happen. And that's the way they work. There are other folks who need to have that kind of discourse, that kind of language in mind, because that's the way it works. Am I being clear there? There are a host of skills. I'm going to go through these in question-answer time. Ask me about these if you like. One of the skills in ministry that is so crucial is what the Greeks called aesthesis. That means the capacity to size up a situation. Have you ever been with a pastor who's working in a church and you watch her deal with a situation that arises and you find that that person just handles that in a way that is simply, you're amazed. And you say, how on earth did you know to do what you did? And they may say something, I don't know, it just seemed right. So that's one. A second one is what John Milbank calls Baroque poiesis. Poiesis, simply for the moment, simply means making. And what he means by Baroque poiesis is it's when you are doing something and you don't know the aim or the end of what you're doing. All right? You're in the middle of it. And you're trying to work with what you've got, not knowing exactly where it's going to wind up. Listen to some of his language. Some of his language is this: direction emerges with the shaping of the action or product. He says destinations are other than starting points. That happens in ministry all the time. You walk into a hospital room and you've got a patient there that you've not seen in 3 days. You don't know what you're going to be trying to do when you first walk into that room. It emerges in the conversation, if there is conversation, or if there isn't any conversation and the person is unconscious. What do I do now? You see what I'm saying? How it emerges in the practice, in the process itself. That's a key practice in ministry. There's another thing that I like to call the zone. Do you ever, in preaching, do you ever get into a moment where things take off? You know that it doesn't just work. It's almost that you don't have to think about it because the thinking is so intrinsic in what you're doing. You know what I mean? But it takes off. Those of you who dance have known moments when the dance simply just took off and you were in the zone. That kind of thing. Shannon Crago Snell has written a wonderful book called The Empty Church. And what she does in that book is she takes theater and a lot of the thought, the discourse about theory, and relates it to theology. It's simply an amazing book. And she talks about those writers on theater who suggest that what you really want is an empty theater if you're going to do a play. All right. Now, what does she mean by that? She says, well, first of all, there's what she calls kibble, detritus. That's all that thingy stuff that's always there and around us, and it can so preoccupy us we can't get past it. Now, what she means repetition. You got to have repetition in theater. You're reading a script, for crying out loud, right? You got to have tradition, yeah, and you got to have expectation. She says all three of those are important, but when you start focusing on those three, it can really lock you up and keep you from doing what needs to be done. She says, do you need tradition? Of course you need tradition. But tradition needs to take its place in the zone. She calls it an emptiness. And she talks about worship that way. That have you ever gone into a worship service and you got in mind exactly what you're going to do, and you're going to do these 3 or 4 things, and you find out it doesn't work at all? And she says what we really need is we need people who go to church, who come there, yes, with expectation, who come there with tradition, of course, who come there knowing there'll be repetition. My Lord, yes, you want to do the Lord's Prayer. At the same time, those things can so cramp worship. Think about it at other times, though, when it has simply taken off. And that's what I'm trying to suggest by the zone. And what she means is we need the discipline, hear that, we need the discipline of emptiness so that we come to church empty, not because that's not there, but empty, waiting for the visible to become invisible. Right? I'm sorry, waiting for the invisible to become visible. An hour is just not enough time. Let me go on. Let me suggest then, in terms of our practices, three kind of concluding issues, if you will. I would urge you to rethink the way an awful lot of people, and that's especially true in pop culture, think about the self. In the United States today, and it's encouraged powerfully by a consumerist framing of things, but in our society, people are told over and over again, you have an essence, and what you need to do is discover your essence and fulfill that essence. I guess I don't want to rule that out entirely, but I guess I want to say to you, as an old man who did his share of that, I don't think that's nearly as important as something else. I know a man who spent 10 years in therapy, and I am not against therapy. But what he did was he found out that he was a person who didn't pay much attention to detail, and he was a person who wasn't very disciplined, and he was a person that there were a lot of things he just didn't like to do. Now, he managed to marry a woman who will do most of those things for him. But what he's basically done is make an excuse for himself to do not to have to do all kinds of things, because that's not his essence. That's not who he is. Anybody ever run into that? Could I suggest that maybe what we need to be doing is not so much self-discovery? Foucault said, refuse the self. But I would say what we need to be looking at is formation of the self. Oh my. I grew up in South Mississippi. And if I had followed my essence, I think I could have been a Ku Kluxer. You understand? I don't know. I find a whole lot more important than self-discovery is calling. I want to say to people, find your call and then engage in those practices that will shape you to be able to be obedient to it, where you engage in that craft tradition of knowing, and when you learn where God is calling you and what is required for you to be able to do that kind of work and that kind of ministry. I would urge you to think about calling far more than self-discovery. All right. Secondly, I'm arguing for a different kind of freedom. The way we talk about freedom in a consumerist world, and I am not talking Roe v. Wade right now. I support Roe v. Wade, so don't go there. But the way in which you think about freedom in a consumerist society is in terms of choice. And I want to tell you, that's a screw-up. Can I put it in that kind of academic language? Let me put it this way. My friend Gene Lowry is a fine jazz pianist. If you can sing a hymn, whistle a hymn, hum a hymn, he can take that melody and turn it into a fine jazz rendition. Okay? Now, myself, all of my choices are open when it comes to the piano, to quote a consumerist line. I can't play a note. I can play, I guess I could play twiddlywink, what do you call it? You know, da, 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 da. All of my choices are open. But you know, I think maybe the freedom that Gene has with a piano is far greater than the freedom I have with a piano. A consumerist society wants you to have the freedom of choice because they believe that if you think freedom is choice, they can convince you of the next choice you need to make. I've been suggesting in this series of lectures not only the fluency, but also the issue of walking the walk. That real freedom is capaciousness. I've tried to say it this way. Capaciousness involves us in a tradition in which we take on agency precisely in the ability to think, speak, and move easily and expertly in a form of life. It is to know what can be said and what can be done in a particular setting. Capaciousness involves intimate familiarity with and proficiency in the feel, the rhythms, and the temporality of way of life. It is to possess a timing, to understand location, to intuit the atmosphere of a situation, to read emotions, and to work within the dispositions and the sensibilities of a socio-cultural context. Emily talked about Jimmy Hope. She blew my cover. Jimmy Hope got a PhD in aesthetics. Now, he talks like this, and he ain't ever changed the way he talks. He comes out of South Alabama, and but he knows aesthetics. He knows old Kant, but everybody knows Kant, whether they know Kant or not. You know, he knows all them people, you know, Hegel, and he just studied this stuff back. He loves to go to a party, and when he gets to a party, he likes to talk about art, and people think he's dumb. Well, let me tell you, if you think Jimmy Hope is dumb talking about art, and you try to do him in, it's like French kissing a rattlesnake. All right, so that's Jimmy Hope. Now, Jimmy Hope's got a daddy, and I'll apologize this beforehand. Jimmy Hope's got a daddy who is not redeemed, certainly not fully. All right, I don't know what God's going to do, but nevertheless not fully. But Jimmy Hope loves his daddy, loves to go see him. And at his daddy's house, the TV set goes on when the first person up in the morning hits the button and turns it on. Last person in bed at night hits the button and turns it off. All day long, that thing, that eternal eye just shines, okay? They take naps in front of it. They eat breakfast, lunch, and supper in front of TV. They entertain company in front of TV. Now, there is a sacred hour when As the World Turns would come on. You didn't talk, okay? They're sitting there one day, they're having a wonderful conversation. And the face of Jesse Jackson comes on the screen of the TV. And Jimmy Hope's daddy says, "That SOB, somebody ought to shoot him. They just ought to shoot him." Daddy, you really believe that? I do. Well, Daddy, if you really believe that, then I think you ought to go to church Sunday. And I think you ought to pray for somebody to shoot Jesse Jackson. What's the matter with you, boy? Are you crazy? No, Daddy, I ain't crazy. I just think if you really believe somebody ought to do that, you ought to go to church and pray for it. Boy, you know good and well Jesus ain't going to put up with that shit. I want to say to you, that is capaciousness. That is capaciousness. That's the kind of freedom I want to apprentice for. All right? And then one last piece, and that's grace. I know you've wondered, are you talking works righteousness? No, I don't think I am. I am a Methodist, I'm a Wesleyan, and I believe God's grace is universally available out there. And that God's grace has already initiated work with us. We don't steal the march on God. I worry sometimes that when we talk about grace, grace can sound like a kind of an intra-psychic interaction. You know God loves you, you know that mentally, and so yes, I'm going to trust that God loves me. My problem with that is that so much of it occurs inside my own subjectivity. You understand what I mean? And I want to think about grace as God's power. Ken Carter, who's a wonderful bishop in the United Methodist Church, now retired, living in South Carolina, but teaches in the Lutheran School of Theology there, good friend of mine. He says this: rather than grace being a packaged gift dispensed by God, grace is God's presence and power. Ooh, do I like that? God's presence and power. It is not merely a subjective dynamic. To create, heal, forgive, reconcile, and transform persons, communities, nations, and the entire cosmos. Where God is present, there is grace, and God's power with that to renew and to transform. So when I'm talking about fluency and when I'm talking about walking the walk, I'm talking about responding to that power of God's grace, and our response being one of embodied and material practices. So it's not some works righteousness, and it's certainly not only some intra-psychic kind of dynamic going on. So I'll leave you with this comment from Wesley, which I cannot locate, but I was told by Kevin Legree it's Wesleyan. All right. Wesley said this: think of God's grace as a great wind, powerful wind blowing across the sea. And think of our practices of holiness, our practices of faithfulness, our practices of discipleship. Think of those as in response to God's grace and raising a sail into the wind. All right? Raising a sail into the wind. I think that's the direction. I think that's the strength for a fluency and the material practice of being a faith that is profoundly calling us to be a part of a way of life. Thank you very much. I understand. It'll take a minute. It'll be on. Yeah. Just takes a minute. It's not quite working yet. He's working. It's just warming up. Hello? Hello? Oh, in other words, it's not a PA mic. Oh, so I need to talk loud when I respond. All right. Comments or questions?
If this doesn't throw you too much off, last night you suggested that you would talk about the difference between religion and spirituality, or talk about religion and spirituality. Could you address that now?
Yeah. You remember what I said about religion last night and the way that's a concept invented by the discourse of the nation state, and that it was very individualistic, privatistic, peripheral, et cetera. Now, I don't want to characterize all spirituality one way. But let me say that what I find in a lot of spirituality expressed today, first of all, it's usually distinguished from institutional religion. My concern about a lot of spirituality is that it's closely tied to self-fulfillment. And the problem with self-fulfillment, and one philosopher whose name I'm blocking right now wrote Sources of the Self. He says that self-fulfillment without a good is zero. That self-fulfillment per se, that does not name a good, is a cipher. Okay, and I don't know, but I think I may have said last night, I've been meeting in a bar with people for the last 6 months or so in Kansas City, in which we can talk about anything you want to. It's theological conversation. And I'm struck by, I don't get a lot of content when people talk about self-fulfillment. I want to know what good's involved. So I find some spirituality doesn't really seem to have that. It seems to be primarily about self-fulfillment. And it seems to have the notion of having my needs filled. Now, I want real human needs filled. But I'm concerned that a lot of needs sound like wants, and a lot of wants sound like people who are not prepared to engage in apprenticeship of whatever endeavor it might be, but to engage in an apprenticeship that will lead them to a journey person status. And so I'm concerned that an awful lot of spirituality I hear is not dedicated to fluency, on the one hand, or material practice. It's not disciplined in that sense. And I really am in the spot in which I want spirituality to be concerned about dropping the meat. Does that help? That kind of, it's a kind of a, I think a lot of spirituality makes you a sucker for capitalist consumerism. if you will. Does that help? Push it if I need to say more, but okay. Does that help? Yeah. Back here, please.
You talk about the fluency of spirituality and the bad spirituality. So what would be your idea of good spirituality, a good fluency in spirituality?
Yeah. Well, in terms of my own faith tradition, I was trying to say fluency, you know, what that would look like last night. Assad calls fluency apt utterance, saying the right word at the right time in the right place. You know, and so in a spirituality that would be able to do that. And I think that requires a lot of skill. I don't mean by that to neglect the fact that God's grace is powerfully there, but God's grace, you know, and responding to that in terms of apt utterance. I was saying last night, you know, I believe that God has revealed Himself finally and ultimately in Christ, and I believe that. But I don't think I'll ever understand it. So for me, I don't know, I don't want that. What I think people in the Christian faith need to be doing is becoming trained and coming to the capacity to be fluent about that kind of gospel. And in that kind of fluency, to realize that we never get it right. One of the worst, I was on the airplane yesterday with a guy who started asking me about, what do you do with end times? And I just said, well, we don't know much. He thought we knew more. But I was so delighted the woman on the other side of him was so glad to know we didn't know much. So I think there's a real place for humility there. And I meant last night very much when I said, I am not able to deny that God has spoken to other traditions. I have a friend named Stan Hauerwas. This may interest you if I read correctly. Somebody asked him one day, what do we do about saving the Jews? And Stan's response was, they're already the chosen people of God. What have you got to offer? I think that's rather valuable. You know, so fluency, I thought Stan was rather fluent with that. It means I can't define it. In fact, I almost say if you define it, you've missed it. What you wind up trying to do is describe and make it concrete by story and, you know, and people. But I would say in some sense it would be that apt utterance. Okay. Comment? Question? I know I messed up more than that, so. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. This is not a very fully formed question, and I'm a PhD student, so I can make a fully formed question take a long time. So I'll bear you all that. What I'm left with is thinking about, I'm hoping you can say more about the role of community and the role of the other, because a lot of this I've heard is sort of individual formation, the pianist, you know, the Laurence Olivier running his lines. What role of the other, the person to whom he's delivering the line, the community? So if you could just talk a little bit more about community.
Yeah, let me say two things about that, because you're dead right. Those illustrations do convey a kind of at least a personalism, if not an individualism. What I was really trying to demonstrate with Meryl Streep is her participation in a tradition of acting. And with Laurence Olivier, he participates in a tradition of acting. Nobody operates outside of a tradition, on my view. The question is, which tradition is it? Or maybe it's more than one. I find a lot of us in the United States operate out of a couple of traditions and they war with each other. And what I've been trying to suggest is which one you feed will shape who you become in that sense. So I certainly did not, the problem with a story is that you you can get into the personalizing something so much you don't talk about how powerfully social and corporate that is. I've been involved in community organizing pretty heavily for the last 15 years, 10 to 20 hours a week, so I've been doing a lot of that. And one of the things that is utterly key in organizing is what's called a one-to-one or one-on-one, meeting where you meet with somebody, and what you're trying to do is establish not a private friendship in the sense of that more deeply intimate kind of friendship, but a public friendship in which you know each other, what you care about, and know something of what kind of commitment you're prepared to make, and where your concerns are, your interests are. And so you begin to build relationships that way. So I find that to be a powerful way to begin to build corporate. Now you can move from that then to what we call house meetings or small group meetings. I found, since I've been in the pastorate, on Maundy Thursday, we're a small church, 100 members. We have a Maundy Thursday service. We had about 30 people there. And what we did there was we had the Eucharist, but we also did one-on-ones so that everybody in the room turned. And I was concerned because it's a small church and they know each other pretty well. But I'm not talking about my genius here, I'm talking about organizing in its sense of corporate life. What happened was, I don't think there was a person in that room who didn't tell me how much they appreciated doing the one-on-one and that they learned something about somebody in the room they had never known before. So finding ways of making the church corporate by that kind of sharing. I would say that's not a public friendship in the church. That's an ecclesial friendship. Again, it may not, you don't tell somebody some deep, dark secret that you would do in therapy. That might not be appropriate, So it's really, but it's church, ecclesial, friendship, and building those kind of ties and relationships in the church, and of course reaching out. Let me talk about otherness another way to make it more corporate. I work out of a Christian tradition, and I say that quite forthrightly, and the interfaith circles in which I work, that's understood because we expect people to talk out of their tradition, not out of some generalized American religion, And where I've been helped a lot in terms of approaching the other is actually in the New Testament. If you know, when Jesus is asked to talk about love, the person he chooses to embody that is the Good Samaritan, who is clearly other, And then I think about the centurion. This is a soldier in an army who has Israel under captivity. And you remember the story where the centurion has a slave or a servant who needs Jesus' healing power. But he says to Jesus, you don't even need to come, I'm making the story short, you don't even need to come see him. I'm a military officer. I know how it goes. You just give the order. It's done. And what does Jesus say? This is an officer in an army that is oppressing his country. Jesus said, I have never seen such faith in all of Israel. Now, the one I love are the parallel stories. The Canaanitic woman, and the other, that Canaanitic woman and the Syrophoenician woman. I'm at that age where names drop out of my memory. Amazing. She comes, the story is very similar. She comes, she wants him to help her with her daughter. And he says, you don't give food to the dogs. I mean, that's the meanest thing, I think, in the New Testament from Jesus, One person said that she caught him with his compassion down. But then she says, yeah, but they let the dogs eat the food from under the table. Now, a lot of people like to interpret that, well, Jesus was just doing that for the other folks. Maybe. I think he changed his mind. I think he changed his mind. I don't know, that's pretty high testimony to me about how we're to deal with people who are other. And it seems to me to be in that spirit and dealing with people of other faith traditions is key. So it'd be otherness in both of those terms. Is that fair enough? Am I speaking loud enough that you can hear? Yeah.
You're alluding to it somewhat now in terms of the implications of what you're having to say, not only to the Jewish religion, but also to Islam.
Yeah, sure.
Not only in terms of religion, but also in terms of the political realities that we are facing today, in terms of the political decisions that have been made, say, in the light of the last 2 weeks. What do you see some of the implications of some of what you have been saying, particularly today?
I have to talk about that in terms of the nation state, okay? I think that the United States and Europe and probably some other places have made a terrible mistake in terms of the way in which they've regarded Islamic states, okay? And what I mean by that, and I think probably the best place to read this would be Assad's work in that respect. He's, I think, got a wonderful bead. He says that the thing about most Islamic societies is that we come in wanting them to accept the kind of separation between church and state that we have, and to have the kind of discourse that I've laid out on a couple of occasions about religion in general, with faith traditions as different species of that more general concept. And he says that is not going to happen in Islam. And he says part of the problem is the way in which other countries attempt to impose that pattern on an Islamic state. And we are just so sure that we're right. Now, I hope it's clear. I certainly don't appreciate the way that women are treated in some Islamic societies. I don't appreciate the way they're treated here. You talk about football. My hunch is we're seeing just the surface of something that's far more prominent than we've known. My point is, we need to open up to the fact that the other states in the world may not be like the United States. And that part of our problem is that we've gone in trying to press for those kinds of democracies, when maybe what we need to do is see the emergence of something out of that context that will be different and look different. I'm trying to say I think the United States needs to appreciate otherness. And I don't think we've done that adequately. Now, we've got a special problem in terms of Israel, you know, Palestine, and I stand with this two-state solution. And that's going to require its own kind of contextual, I don't like that word, but it's going to have to be specific to those places. And the idea of imposing something from above or from out here on it, and I want both of those parties respected. I really think that if there had been a commitment to nonviolence in terms of the Palestinians, I think this thing would have been settled, quite frankly. But anyhow, does that give you a sense of where I'm coming from? I think a lot of our issues around otherness have to do with our identification of Christian faith with the nation state and the proposal it's made. As I said the other day, somebody was telling me we can't do voter registration because that's too political. Says who? Says who? You know, I don't get it. And there's got to be that alternative community in tension with the state. And the reason why I've been emphasizing fluency and these other practices is to generate and form a body, a corporate people who are not like that. We're different than that. So.
Dr. Tex, I appreciate very much the two lectures. Last night you were talking about the fluency, and this morning you were talking about I mean, for me, the key word was formation. You were, I think, citing somebody saying that as formation is more important than self-discovery. So last night I was thinking about that you were saying about language, and then how fluency, and then I remember that in Genesis there was a chaos, and the world was formatted or was made by the Word. And then you see John chapter 1 and the Logos, although the idea of Logos in Greek had the inner idea, that the idea in itself, but of course that has then afterward the language. So a quick comment, then a question for you. So do you think that the fluency in terms of words or language also is forming or is making the reality, or let's see that we as ministers in church, we see the chaos, and by the fluency and by the words we are able to put order in that situation. So this is what you're trying to see, and I'm saying connecting fluency and formation in two lectures.
Thank you. I do see a very important role for language in terms of course, our experience, but also your suggestion about ordering our lives together. The only concern I have there is to make sure we don't get some idea that there's some group that's doing all the ordering. You know, that fluency, one of the reasons why I worked on fluency is because it is so corporate. None of us makes up words, or at least I've never made up a word. Have you? And I don't know very many people who really have. So I love the work of, do you know Saba Mahmood's work, Politics and Piety? I just think it's an absolutely delicious book. She says that the self, or the subject would be her word, the subject is formed in the discourse and the practices of a form of life. But that's where we become subjects. And so there the issue is not so much self-discovery, though you certainly need to look back at the way you're formed. I'm not opposing analysis there. And I don't want to say don't ever do self-discovery. There's a wonderful anthropologist by the name of Aaron Fox who did this book called Real Country, and he studies for 3 years a honky-tonk in Lockhart, Texas, and he records their conversations and their languages and how they use language and words and how it has shaped who they are. It's just a delightful, it's not only delightful, it is such a powerful piece of work. So that I'm trying to suggest that when we're talking about fluency, yeah, there is a real role for us as an alternative community to do some critique of some language, you know, like the critique of experience. Is it a commodity, or is it really being experienced in a form of life? Or like freedom, is it really just choice? I don't want to take decisions away from people. That's not my point. But I'm talking about how you basically conceive freedom. Is it just choice, or is it really capaciousness? I think it's the latter. And my hunch is that if we can come up with more compelling ways to talk about the faith, more compelling ways to challenge some of the kind of stuff that's going on in this culture, I think that there's a lot of hunger out there for that. So it's in that sense that I'm trying to, I certainly don't want people simply to adopt samples of language. That would be a screw up of the first order. Is that helpful? Yeah. Other comments, questions? You can make your own speech, of course.
Once again, Tex, I want to thank you for being with us and giving us a whole bunch to chew on. And I'm so pleased that this is being archived, because this will be a teaching moment for several generations to come. Thank you, sir. Thank you all for being here. Have a good